It was the autumn of 1890 in Wrentham, Massachusetts, when the leaves turned a bitter shade of copper and the shadows stretched longer than they should. At the time, Wrentham was a quiet town, tucked between Franklin and Norfolk, where families hung wash from cedar posts and church bells marked the passing of hours like gentle reminders, a picturesque place on the surface. In the center of town stood the Winslow House, a three-story colonial with deep green shutters, white-clapboard siding, and a wraparound porch that hosted tea in spring and cider in fall. Children dared one another to run up and touch the porch rail, not because it looked haunted, it didn't, but because something about it made their stomachs twist. No one ever lasted more than a second. The Winslow family had lived there for 3 generations. By 1890, it belonged to Ambrose Winslow, a well-spoken widower, 54, respected if not particularly warm. He ran the town's only apothecary and served on the school board. If Wrentham had a picture of civic pride, it might have been Ambrose in his tweed coat and bowler hat, always with a stiff nod and the faintest smile. His daughter, Clara Winslow, age 17, played piano at First Parish on Sundays. She was soft-spoken, eyes always on the floor. Neighbors whispered she hadn't spoken in full sentences since her mother's death 4 years prior. Some chalked it up to grief. Others, those who paid closer attention, noted how Clara never made eye contact, even with those she knew well. I spoke with Reverend Dalton in an archived interview from 1922. There was always a stiffness to Ambrose. He'd come to service alone most days, only Clara beside him on the major holidays. I remember she winced once during a hymn, and I thought it wasn't the music, something else, something deeper. The Winslow household employed one live-in servant, Elsie Corwin, a quiet woman in her early 30s. She had arrived in town under vague circumstances around 1886. No one knew where she came from, just that she stayed. And there was the apothecary itself. Compact, meticulously organized, with dark mahogany counters and rows of glass bottles labeled with neat handwritten script. Locals trusted Ambrose's remedies, tinctures for headaches, salves for burns, even his infamous migrania bitters, which some swore by and others avoided entirely. But behind the counters, in the locked back room, were cabinets that no assistant ever touched. Shelves stacked with instruments, volumes in Latin, and something else, a set of thin journals bound in worn leather, each marked only by a year. The facade, as always, was perfect. There were no missing persons, no reports of violence. The Winslows paid their taxes, the lawn was always trimmed, but if you spoke to the older residents, those who remembered that time, you'd hear the same phrase over and over again. There was something wrong in that house. I tracked down Margaret Hellinger, great-granddaughter of one of the town's early doctors. She keeps a preserved collection of her family's letters. She read one aloud. The child, Clara, came in again today. No visible bruising, but the girl flinched at the sound of my voice. Her pulse raced. I asked if anything at home was troubling her, and she looked to the door before answering. That fear, that silence, I know it. I've seen it before in war refugees. Something is happening there, but I fear I lack the authority to intervene. Margaret's fingers trembled on the page. She folded it carefully, slid it back into the tin box where she keeps such things. From the outside, the Winslow home was a monument to order, a family touched by grief but not scandal, a man of medicine, respected, a daughter of delicate disposition, a servant with no past. But underneath, the floorboards of that house held more than dust. The first real sign would come just weeks later, when a group of schoolboys chasing a runaway ball stumbled too close to the cellar window. One would later tell police he saw what looked like a jawbone resting on a shelf, no skin, just clean teeth, like someone polished it. The others laughed at him then, called it imagination. But he wasn't wrong. It began, as it often does, with whispers. Wrentham in the late 19th century was not the kind of place where concerns were broadcast. People minded their own. But when it came to the Winslow house, they noticed in their own quiet ways. It started with Clara. She'd stopped attending services altogether by late October. At first, people assumed illness. Then, odd explanations filtered in. She was not quite herself, Ambrose would say. melancholy or seasonally unwell. Nothing unusual, nothing worth prodding. But Clara's absence from town life grew conspicuous. She no longer visited the dressmaker, no longer picked up deliveries, and no one saw her at the piano again. Mrs. Penelope Grover, who lived across the street, wrote in her diary, "Saw Mr. Winslow walking alone again. No Clara, curtains drawn, lights on in the basement late, odd flickering like candlelight but stronger. I counted the windows, 10 in total. Only one was ever lit." At the schoolhouse, her former classmates muttered that Clara was being punished or gone to a sanatorium. One girl, Ruthie Prentice, remembered something else. In an oral history recorded in 1943, she recalled, "Clara gave me a small note once. No words, just a drawing. A stick figure under floorboards, teeth drawn like stars all around it. I didn't understand. I laughed. She snatched it back and tore it to pieces." At the same time, other oddities began to accumulate. Dr. Benjamin Allen, one of the town's 2 physicians, made an entry in his logbook that was never submitted to the Board of Health, but was kept in a private drawer, sealed. We obtained it through his estate. It reads, "Was called to the Winslow house after dusk. Unusual request. Clara had injured her hand. Deep lacerations between the fingers. Looked like a blade wound, though she claimed to have tripped on glass. Ambrose did not allow me to speak with her alone. Something about her eyes, dilated, frantic. I recommended stitches. He refused, said he had his own means. I offered to return the next day. He declined." Another account comes from Samuel Hayes, a young assistant who briefly worked in Ambrose's apothecary that same fall. He only lasted 6 weeks before quitting. He was interviewed in 1902, long after he'd moved away. He said he was obsessed with teeth, not dental care, just teeth. He had a drawer of them. I opened it by accident. Some were clearly human. He said it was for anatomical study, but why keep them in a velvet pouch, locked in the desk? Samuel also recalled a single incident he couldn't forget. A customer came in, Mr. Liddell, from the blacksmith's shop, asked for laudanum. "Doctor." Winslow stepped out of the back room, but his coat sleeve was soaked, something dark like blood or ink. He noticed me staring, just smiled, real calm. Said, "Tinctures sometimes stain, Samuel. You do well to wear gloves." The deeper we looked, the more disquieting the portrait became. Even the house itself began changing. Carpenters recalled being called for odd tasks. One was paid in full for reinforcing basement joists, even though, as he told his wife, nothing down there needed reinforcement. Another, a mason, said he was asked to brick over a crawl space, then sworn to silence. The walls of the Winslow basement were already thick, stone packed with lime, but it was the beams, thick, aged oak, that would later tell the real story. Etched into them were carvings, dozens of them, names, symbols, dates, and in certain corners, tiny sockets in the wood precisely chiseled, each the size of a molar, as if the beams themselves were built to hold teeth. Of course, no one in town knew that yet, not until the smells started. In December, neighbors began to report it, a thick metallic scent, burnt and sickly, that wafted through the air on damp mornings. Some thought it was spoiled meat, others rotting wood, but a few knew better. One letter, unsigned, was sent to the local constable. It read simply, "Something terrible is happening on Elm Street, the Winslow house. The smell is not of the earth, it is the smell of death." But nothing came of it, because Ambrose Winslow was, after all, a respected man, a man who had delivered over half the town's babies, a man who donated generously to the church, who kept to himself, who spoke well, and besides, no one had gone missing, not yet. On the night of January 14th, 1891, the frost lay thick over Wrentham. Icicles hung like glass daggers from eaves, and even the dogs seemed reluctant to bark. That night, at precisely 2:12 a.m., a light was seen in the upper attic window of the Winslow house, an area no one in town had ever been invited to see. By dawn, the rumors began. It was the milkman, Gerald Huxley, who first noticed the front gate ajar. Odd, he thought. Ambrose was a man of routines, precise, orderly. But that morning, the gate creaked, And more unsettling still, the front door was slightly open, not wide, just enough to suggest someone forgot to close it. That alone would have been strange, but what Gerald saw through the threshold made him drop the milk pail. Clara, barefoot in a white nightdress, was standing in the front hall, her arms limp at her sides. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out. Her hair was matted to her face, and blood, thick and congealed, streaked down one of her legs. Huxley shouted, stumbled backward, then ran. By the time the town constable arrived, Clara was gone. The door had been shut. Ambrose Winslow answered in his usual composed manner. He claimed Clara had sleepwalked, something she'd done since childhood. There was no blood, he insisted, no distress. The milkman must have been mistaken. Constable Rowan wrote a brief incident note, filed it as a domestic misunderstanding, and went on his way. But Clara was not seen again, not at the market. Not at church, not in the garden, where she once collected herbs under her father's watch. And it was that silence, more than anything, that pushed Elsie Corwin to act. Elsie had kept her head down for 5 years in the Winslow house. She was a woman used to secrets, but even she could no longer pretend. According to a sworn affidavit, which only surfaced decades later, she made one late-night visit to Reverend Dalton's parsonage, cloaked and shivering. "I need sanctuary," she told him, "and I need someone to believe what I say." In her testimony, Elsie claimed Clara had not left the house. She was locked in the attic. For how long? Days, weeks, she didn't know. Food was brought to her on a tray. No one was allowed to speak with her. Ambrose called it a spiritual purification, said the girl had been touched by impurity. Elsie said she heard Clara crying most nights, but there was something else, something worse. According to her, the basement had become a place of ritual. "He said he was studying the seat of the soul," she whispered, "said the teeth held memory, that every life left residue in the roots, that with enough of them, one could see what God sees." She described dozens of small silk pouches, each with teeth inside, tagged and numbered. Some were from animals, but not all. Some were still stained. The beams, she said, had once been clean. But over the past year, Ambrose had begun carving, not decorative scrollwork, but names, dates, Bible verses. And Clara's name appeared at least 7 times, in multiple places. When Reverend Dalton asked why she had stayed so long, Elsie answered in a whisper, "Because I didn't know where else to go, and because he said if I left, he'd pull mine too." She was terrified. She refused to return to the house. The Reverend offered her shelter, and the following morning he went to speak with the town council. They were skeptical, of course. Accusations of that nature were serious, especially against a man like Ambrose Winslow. But something about Elsie's demeanor, the specificity of her claims, and Clara's long absence made them hesitate. 2 council members voted to launch an inquiry. 1 abstained. The others declined, saying the matter could be resolved privately. But someone else had been listening. A boy, 12 years old, who worked odd jobs around town. Joseph Harnell. He'd once helped Ambrose clean out the apothecary basement. He knew a side entrance, and now, filled with curiosity and fear, he returned. On January 23rd, Joseph slipped into the basement alone. He never made it past the first room. According to his later testimony, the air was heavy, like metal and vinegar. On the shelves were glass jars, some filled with liquid, others with small bones. And there, nailed into the beam directly ahead, was a human molar, yellowed, cracked. He ran, and that's when the townspeople began to act. Letters were sent to the county sheriff in Norfolk. A formal petition was drafted, an emergency search warrant requested. Still, Ambrose Winslow acted as if nothing had changed. He walked the streets with dignity, even nodded to Gerald Huxley, the milkman, as if their last encounter had never occurred. And then, late on the evening of February 3rd, the parsonage bell rang once. Reverend Dalton opened the door and found a girl standing on his porch. Clara, gaunt, pale, eyes hollow. She didn't speak, just held out her hand. In it, a tiny wooden carving of a mouth opened wide, with one tooth missing. When Clara Winslow stepped across the threshold of the parsonage that night, she didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply walked forward, set the wooden carving down on the Reverend's desk, and sat beside the fire. She hadn't spoken a word in nearly 6 months, but within the next 48 hours, she told everything. The transcripts of her testimony, painstakingly recorded by Reverend Dalton in his ledger, were later sealed by court order and only made public nearly a century later. But now we have them. "He said the soul was stored in the mouth," Clara told him. "He said our words are the residue of our spirit. So the teeth, they're the roots of it. Like seeds, if you plant them right, they talk back." According to Clara, the rituals began shortly after her mother's death. At first, Ambrose was inconsolable, his grief consuming, but grief soon shifted. He began reading constantly. Volumes from Germany, from London, most of them fringe tracts on phrenology, mystical anatomy, and dental anthropology, a field so obscure even the Royal College of Surgeons refused to recognize it. He came to believe that the human mouth was not just a mechanical structure, but a metaphysical gate. "He told me," Clara said, "your mother's spirit is still here. I can feel it. I just need to find the right tooth." He began collecting, at first animal teeth, then those of the recently deceased. Clara watched him boil skulls in large brass pots in the basement, strip the bones clean, polish the teeth with oil and ash. He recorded everything meticulously in his journals. Entries like number 48, lower incisor, female, age Est, 26, exposure to moonlight for 3 nights, no whisper, further test, prayer plus blood. Eventually, he turned to Clara. She said he would press her face against the beams in the basement, whispering scripture. Then he carved her name beside the others. He never struck her, not in the traditional sense, but he cut her, small incisions at the gums, extracting milk teeth she'd lost years before but kept hidden in a locket her mother gave her. "He said they were pure," she whispered, "untouched by sin, still fresh, still good." She tried to leave once, but he caught her. And after that, he locked her in the attic for weeks. Her meals were sparse, bone broth, boiled oats. When he finally let her out, he took her to the basement and asked her to sit beside the central beam. There, already embedded in the wood, were more than 30 teeth. All human, all labeled with tiny inked initials. Ambrose believed he had nearly perfected it. He had built what he called a lattice of memory, an array of spirits whose residual presence remained embedded in the calcium of their teeth. He thought that by aligning them properly, north to south, oldest to youngest, he could commune with what he called the root voice. Clara watched him kneel before the beams and murmur to them for hours. And then came the final piece. He needed a living offering. He told her that her soul would remain if her final breath was taken among the others, that her voice would join the choir. That night, Clara broke a window in the attic with the leg of a chair and climbed out barefoot over the icy shingles and onto the porch roof. She dropped to the ground and walked to the church. She never once looked back. After her testimony, Reverend Dalton turned the ledger over to the county sheriff. This time, with public pressure mounting, the search warrant was approved within a day. On February 6, 1891, just after noon, 5 deputies arrived at the Winslow residence. Ambrose answered the door. He did not resist. He simply stepped aside and said, "You'll want the basement." They descended, and what they found was exactly what Clara described and more. One of the deputies, a man named Alfred Kent, wrote in his report, "I've seen death before, in war, in fire, in childbirth gone wrong, but I have never seen evil so carefully labeled." Urdi. The basement walls were covered in shelves, jars filled with formaldehyde, dozens of teeth arranged in velvet-lined trays, each with initials, dates, and notes of extraction. A central support beam bore over 50 carvings, names and dates etched by hand. Some matched names of the town's dead, others unknown. The largest carving read, "Exi Oriens, in dentibus veritas, behold the rising, in teeth the truth." The sheriff ordered the house sealed. Every journal, every specimen, every carving was catalogued and photographed. A local dentist confirmed that at least 19 of the teeth were human and from multiple individuals, not related by age or decay pattern. And in the far corner of the basement, partially buried beneath floorboards, they found something else, a small chest, locked. Inside, wrapped in linen, were 12 children's teeth, some still blood-stained. Beneath them, a folded scrap of paper. On it, written in Ambrose's hand, "The final choir will know her voice. In time, they all will." Ambrose Winslow was arrested without incident. He did not flinch when the shackles were fastened, nor when the sheriff read the charges. He simply smiled, tight-lipped, and asked if he might bring his journals with him. The request was denied. That same day, news of the discovery spread like wildfire through Wrentham. Hundreds gathered outside the apothecary and the Winslow home. Families whose relatives had passed in recent years came forward, demanding to examine the records. Others simply came to stare. What disturbed the town most wasn't the collection of teeth. It wasn't even the fact that some were labeled with the names of their own dead. It was how ordinary the evil had looked. Inside the Winslow house, teams worked in shifts cataloging what was now being referred to as the Dental Archive. The Massachusetts State Board of Health joined the investigation. The journals, which spanned over 20 years, revealed a complex web of ritual, pseudoscience, and delusion. Some entries were coldly clinical. Subject 34B, molar, age Esther 9, extracted post-mortem, approx. In 3 hours, tooth intact, residue faint. Others verged into mania. Heard them again last night, singing. They sing through the wood. They want more. The root choir grows. Ambrose referred frequently to something called the arrangement. Investigators interpreted this as the specific alignment of teeth and names nailed into the beams. Sketches found among his papers depicted spirals of teeth, interwoven with passages from Psalms and the Book of Job. One drawing, disturbingly detailed, showed the interior of a human jaw split open, roots extending like tree branches into a beam of oak. The beam itself, now infamously known as the choir beam, was removed under police escort. The stench, once subtle, had deepened. Forensics found traces of blood in 5 separate areas, some matching known decedents. Then came the human remains. On February 8th, a team prying up the flagstones near the rear wall uncovered 2 child-sized femurs curled unnaturally. A shallow grave, then another and another. In total, 5 small skeletons were exhumed from beneath the Winslow basement, each one missing teeth. 2 of them were matched, through surviving dental records and family descriptions, to children who had died years earlier from fever and consumption, but the other 3 unidentified. No death certificates, no missing person reports, nothing. The town's heart broke open. A special inquest was ordered, and the case was declared a matter of public health and criminal urgency. The district attorney from Boston arrived in person. It was one of the first times that the concept of a serial ritualist was openly discussed in Massachusetts legal circles. And through it all, Ambrose Winslow remained calm. At his arraignment, the judge asked if he understood the charges. "I understand," he replied, "that none of you are ready to hear what they've told me." His trial began on March 16, 1891, at the Norfolk County Courthouse. The prosecution focused on unlawful human remains, desecration of corpses, and child endangerment. But without evidence that the deaths were homicides, the charges remained disturbingly limited. The defense tried to argue mental incompetence, that Ambrose had suffered from obsessional melancholia, a madness born of grief after the death of his wife. But the journals revealed something else: intent. One entry, dated 4 years before his wife's death, read, "To extract from the mouth is to extract from the self. I shall begin with the lesser, animals, insects, but in time the human root will bear the truth." The jury deliberated for just 4 hours. Ambrose Winslow was convicted on 4 counts of unlawful disinterment, 3 counts of endangering a minor, and 2 counts of performing unlicensed surgical extractions, but crucially, not murder. There was no definitive cause of death for the skeletons, no eyewitnesses, no confession, He was sentenced to 25 years in the Massachusetts State Prison at Charlestown. He served just under 11. On October 3, 1902, Ambrose Winslow died in his cell. Cause of death: infection following the extraction of 2 of his own teeth with a sharpened nail. The warden reported that when guards entered the cell, they found the teeth arranged on the wall in a precise pattern. One officer remembered, they looked like eyes, watching, waiting. After the conviction, the Winslow house sat vacant. Some said it should be burned. Others wanted it preserved as a warning. In the end, the town quietly demolished it. The beam, the choir beam, was donated to Harvard Medical School for research. It never arrived. Somewhere between Wrentham and Cambridge, the beam vanished. No record, no delivery, no trace, and the teeth, some were buried, some catalogued and stored in state evidence vaults, and others were never found. There's no sign today of the Winslow house in Wrentham. The foundation was leveled in 1904. A school was built on the land a decade later, though that building too no longer stands. The lot is now a public garden, sunflowers in summer, crimson leaves in fall. If you didn't know what had happened there, you wouldn't suspect. People walk their dogs, children play, it is quiet again, but the earth remembers. In 1989, during a minor landscaping project to install a new irrigation system, workers unearthed a small cache, 7 human teeth wrapped in waxed linen, preserved better than they had any right to be. Experts dated the cloth to the late 19th century. DNA testing began, but no matches were ever found. The case of Ambrose Winslow still sits in the archives of the Massachusetts State Records Office under the heading Unlawful Anatomical Collection, Wrentham, a euphemism for what was something much darker. Clara Winslow never returned to the public eye. After the trial, she moved to Maine under a new name. She married briefly, divorced quietly, and eventually died in 1948 in a small coastal town near Belfast. She never had children. No obituary was printed, but in her effects, her neighbor found something odd: a single carved tooth, wooden, smooth, inscribed with her mother's initials. In the years after the trial, Massachusetts passed new legislation, stricter oversight of medical licensing, grave exhumation procedures, and post-mortem specimen handling. The Winslow case became a cautionary tale in state medical schools, not because of what was done in the name of science, but because of what was hidden under the guise of respectability. I spoke with Dr. Helen Carter, a forensic anthropologist who reviewed the case in 2014. "What strikes me," she said, "is how deliberate it all was. This wasn't just madness, it was belief, structured, purposeful belief. He created a system where cruelty became holy, and he did it without ever raising a hand in anger." Ambrose Winslow left behind no heirs. His journals were initially stored by the state, then reviewed by Harvard under special license. In 2003, they were sealed indefinitely. But one entry remains in the public domain, a note scribbled in the margin of his 1889 ledger, written not as observation, but as instruction. "Speak to the teeth. Speak until you hear them speak back. They remember more than you." To date, none of the unidentified remains found beneath the Winslow basement have been matched to living descendants. Their names are lost. Their stories ended where the basement floor began, and the beam, the choir beam, has never resurfaced. Some claim it was stolen. Others say it was burned in secret by officials who feared what it represented. But there are those, archivists, researchers, who believe it's still out there, in some storage room, or in someone's private collection, waiting. In 2019, a private collector in Vermont listed what appeared to be a carved oak beam online. The photo showed a spiral of indentations, small, socketed shapes, but the listing was removed within hours, and the seller's account deleted. We'll never know if it was real. But we do know this: evil doesn't always arrive cloaked in violence. Sometimes it comes neatly dressed, measured in tinctures and teeth, and sometimes it smiles. The town of Wrentham eventually built a memorial, a small plaque set in stone near the corner of the original Winslow lot. It reads, "In memory of the unknown children, may their silence be heard forever." When today, visitors leave tiny things on that plaque, pebbles, pine cones, and sometimes a single tooth, plastic, porcelain, even real. No names, no notes, just a symbol, a reminder of what was done and what still echoes, because what hides behind a perfect smile can be the darkest secret of all. You've been listening to a Macabre record. I'm Daniel Harrow. Stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, even the cleanest floors can have blood beneath the boards.